Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Roberson. I'm a Senior Elections Communication Specialist here at the Elections Group. And I'd like to thank all of you at home for joining our very first webinar in our new Exploring Election Audit series. Before we get started, I do just want to mention to all of our participants that the Q&A feature should be enabled for you, that you can ask questions throughout today's conversation, and hopefully they will be able to answer them during our Q&A portion. I would also like to take a minute for a brief overview of the Elections Group for folks who are joining us for the first time today. So the Elections Group is an elections consulting firm. We're founded by former election officials Jennifer Morrell and Noah Preitz. We work with state and local election officials to help implement new programs or improve processes. And we also provide guidance, resources, and direct management support for jurisdictions. Our team is also made up of all former election officials from across the United States, and we have experience at the state, local, and federal levels of government. With that, I will go ahead and kick things over to our CEO and co-founder, Jennifer Morrell, for today's webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. This is so exciting to be here with all of you today. This is a project that we've spent well over a year working on. We're excited that we have so many of you joining us, some of you friends and colleagues, some of you maybe new to the Elections Group. So we're excited to kick off what we hope is going to be a number of webinars focused on election audits. We have a lot to cover today, but before we dive into the meat of election audits, we're going to start with a few introductions. For those of you that don't know me, as Rebecca mentioned, I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Elections Group. Prior to starting the Elections Group in 2020, I actually spent 10 years as a local election official in both Utah and Colorado. And I've spent the last 5 years really thinking about election audits, teaching other election administrators, helping with implementation of post-election audits, specifically risk-limiting audits. So it's really a pleasure to be able to talk about a subject that's near and dear to my heart today. As Rebecca mentioned, we've got this awesome team of former election officials who are now experts at the Elections Group. There are about 19 of us, full-time, part-time, and contract support. And we provide a number of resources and support to state and local election officials. If you haven't visited our website before, I'd encourage you to take a look. I'm really excited because I'm joined today by 3 of those experts, all of whom spent a lot of time over the last year thinking about election audits, really working to make this report and the work that went into the reports a reality. So I want to give each of them just a few minutes to introduce themselves. They'll tell you a little about their background and the role they played with our Exploring Audits project. And Michelle, I think we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. I'm happy to be here and excited to talk about our project. My name is Michelle Forney. I'm a senior election expert with the Elections Group. I've been working in elections since about 2011. I started off in the Arizona Attorney General's office where I was representing the Secretary of State. And then after that, I moved on to run elections for one of the counties in Arizona for about 5 years, which translates to about 13 elections. And then I moved to Reno after the 2020 elections and took a job with the Nevada Secretary of State's office, where I was put in charge of implementing the pilot program for risk limiting audits. And that is actually how I got to know Jennifer so well. And then she kindly offered me a job. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Michelle. Danny.
Hi, good afternoon or good morning to all of our participants, depending on where you are in the country. My name is Danny Davenport, and I'm an elections expert at the Elections Group. Formerly, before coming to the Elections Group, I worked for the Virginia Department of Elections, and my role there was as a legislation and policy analyst. And I covered a lot of topics from absentee voting, mail voting, early voting, accessibility for individuals with disabilities, but I also had the privilege in that role of helping to administer and craft policy for the first risk limiting audit that was administered statewide in Virginia. So I was really excited to join the Elections Group and work specifically on this topic. And I'm really excited to talk to all of you today about all the cool things we've learned and discovered in the process.
Thanks, Danny. Mike, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I'm in Pennsylvania, so I'm one of the good afternoon folk. And let's see here. So my election experience goes all the way back to 2004. I've always worked at the local level. So from 2004 through 2019, I worked for 3 different counties in Colorado. I actually started entry level, just doing data entry, and worked my way up to director. And one thing that's really exciting while I was out in Colorado, relevant to this workshop, is working for a county when we were first implementing risk limiting audits. So then after that, after Colorado, I was an elections director in Pennsylvania for a county in northeastern Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania was just introducing the idea of risk limiting audits. And so it's still kind of new to us. So very excited to be here this morning and share with everyone.
Thanks, Mike. And I hope those of you watching recognize that not only were the team members that were sort of leading this project experts in elections and experts in election audits, it was really important to us that we also brought in expertise from throughout the election community, and you'll hear more about that today. When I go out and I talk to election officials about the value of audits, I always like to start with my experience years ago, many years ago, as an active duty member of the Air Force. I saw firsthand the role that internal tests and quality control checks coupled with independent audits played in ensuring the readiness of our military. And if you think about it, we can see the same impact on other things that we interact with every day, such as the efficacy of our medication and the quality of our food, or even the solvency of our financial institutions. And I'm guessing that all of you signed up for this webinar also recognize the value audits can have in our elections. Audits help us detect election system errors, whether those are human errors or some type of misconfiguration. Audits do a great job in helping us provide accountability to our voters by providing evidence that ballots were issued and counted and reported accurately. And audits can be a deterrent to fraudulent activity. And maybe just as importantly, especially for those of you that are charged with administering elections, audits can provide feedback to help you improve your process. Historically, we've really limited the use of audits. Post-election audits are performed to validate vote tabulation systems, but there's no federal requirement. They're not performed in every state. And in the states that do require tabulation audits, the methods and the manner can vary. For example, when we look at tabulation audits from a national perspective, in addition to varying methods for performing those audits, you heard our panelists talk about risk limiting audits. There's certainly other methods for doing tabulation audits that we mentioned in the paper. You'll also see that the sample size varies, when the audit takes place varies, and who conducts the audit is really unique state to state. So in addition to a lack of uniformity, we continue to see people challenging the integrity of our elections in areas well beyond vote tabulation. We've also seen honest mistakes made in election offices that might have been avoided in an environment where a system of audits, tests, and quality control measures is prioritized. And it's always hard for us when we see those in the news because you feel for that office and you think about all the things that might have been done to prevent those mistakes or errors from happening. So I'm really excited about the work that we've done. You see the link in the chat to the report that'll actually take you to a landing page where you can find all of the reports that we're going to discuss today. In our first report, Exploring Audits, Part 1, a holistic approach to auditing elections, we consider principles and standards that might help create more continuity in the way that we conduct elections. We also, in that report, outline some of the challenges that election officials face in implementing our proposed new framework for audits. And given those constraints, we think about how we can ensure that audits are conducted in a way that they're unbiased and they're independent. And so we spent some time in the report considering who should oversee and conduct election audits. Building on Part 1, we focused on identifying critical process areas where we might encourage the election community to look beyond just tabulation audits to other areas of election administration where an issue or an error may be likely to have an impact. I'd like to think of our Exploring Audits Part 2 series as an initial step in building best practices around a variety of pre and post-election audits. So in a minute, we're going to walk you through how we developed both sets of reports, but I'll say now, and I'll probably repeat this at the end, our goal is that these reports are just the beginning. We see them as a seed that ignites more interest in professionalizing these types of audits. We've already received some great feedback from readers of the reports, and we hope that anybody listening or anyone who might be interested is encouraged to review those reports and give us your feedback. Our plan is to update these guides regularly as the work progresses. Great, so hopefully by now, at least some of you have downloaded those reports or clicked on the link. As I said, we want to give you all some background about our research process that led to the development of these reports. We started the project by first trying to read all the literature we could find related to election audits. This includes academic research about various methods for tabulation audits, some of those great NGO reports that focused on principles and standards, as well as some of the case studies and official audit reports that were issued by states and local jurisdictions. And one thing that seemed to be in short supply across all of those were the voices of election professionals. We knew one of the things that might make this project and these reports stand out was ensuring we spent lots of time understanding the needs and perspectives of those charged with running elections. And we decided that the best way to do that was bringing election administrators together, whether that was virtually or in person, with the goal of ensuring we had state officials, as well as local officials from both county and municipal offices. We made sure we looked at large, medium, and small jurisdictions, that they were represented during these discussions. And we invited participants from different political parties to ensure we had varying points of view. So last August, we held our first in-person convening, and our team had so much fun preparing for this by learning about techniques for facilitating large and small group discussions, brainstorming activities, and other activities that would be engaging, that would allow us to squeeze as much as possible out of all of the officials that participated. So Michelle, I want to start with you. Can you share how we laid the groundwork for this project and these workshops?
Sure. We started off thinking that there are election processes that all of us, state and local officials, do across the country. And we also thought there are so many checks and balances already built into the system and into the processes to ensure the accuracy of our elections. So how could we leverage that to improve voter confidence? Because as we all know, that is one of the pain points that we're experiencing right now in elections. So we wanted to start with getting a complete picture of the entire election ecosystem to try to figure out where we could maybe develop some more auditing ideas. So we started off with these huge posters of butcher paper that we put up around the room, and we had kind of our idea of the major election processes. So we had maintaining precincts and districts, voter registration, which includes list maintenance and that kind of stuff. Setting up an election, UACAVA activities, voting by mail or absentee voting, early voting, election day, and then tabulation and results, post-election activities, and then other miscellaneous activities that are related to elections, but not necessarily linked to a specific election. As an example, I'll just tell you, like election day, for example, would include hiring and training election workers, establishing your voting locations, delivering your supplies and your ballots and your equipment, managing observers, and then all of the other tasks that are involved with election day itself. So we had those all on the posters all around the room, and we invited the participants to our workshop to add processes that we may have missed, and also to move things around if it made more sense to them. And what we learned from that is, well, we confirmed that election officials all across the country really do perform the same tasks, even though they frequently use different terminology or have specific requirements that may differ, and of course, different levels of resources. You can read more about the mapping exercises in part 1 of the report, starting at page 9. And I think that's it for now.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Michelle. Danny, I want to turn to you next. So now that we had a map outlining key election processes, can you share a little bit about how we got participants thinking about audits, tests, and quality control checks, and just your reflections from that exercise?
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. So the audits, test, and quality controls sort of portion of our first workshop ended up being one of my favorite activities that we did in this entire process. And I think part of why I really enjoyed it is because we found in our preliminary research, as you sort of mentioned earlier, that a lot of industries that perform audits, that need to validate their processes, also identify processes that need, maybe not a full systematic audit, but the benefit from these smaller, quicker test and quality controls. So I think in our preliminary research, we identified pretty quickly, this is a really important idea to think about what needs a full audit versus a test or a quality control. But I think we also realized that those concepts, the distinctions, can be really difficult to grapple with and understand. And especially they can be really difficult to expect. We've already had so many new disciplines that election officials have had to learn over the past several election cycles, from becoming cybersecurity experts to operations experts to keep lines short. It can be a lot to expect people to become experts on what it means to perform an audit too. But with that fear in mind, we walked into this process and said, we're going to introduce these concepts to election officials. We're going to give them pretty simple definitions, straightforward definitions for each of these. A test asks, will a process work in the future? A quality control asks, is a process that we do in our office currently working as intended? And then an audit looks backwards at a bigger process that just happened and asks, did that work? And when we introduced those ideas to our participants and then showed them the elections map, it was almost automatic that those folks said, hey, we actually already do a ton of test and quality controls in our offices. We already do what approaches being an audit without having known it was an audit for some of our systems. So we literally gave our participants stickers that were color coded and let them walk up to the election process map Michelle had described, which has every election process under the sun on it. And folks walked around and said, hey, I already have a good idea for how we can do a quality control on this, or my office already tests this because it's so important to our operations. So for me, that was sort of a cornerstone, almost the foundation of a lot of our future research, because there were two really big takeaways. One was we learned that election officials, when given the vocabulary, the time, and the resources to be creative, kind of agree. It's important to develop audits, tests, and quality controls to validate our work, because a big part of the job of election administration isn't just doing things correctly. Those of us who work in the field know that we're dedicated to that. It's also being able to demonstrate to the public and to voters that we're doing things correctly and to give them confidence in the process. The other thing that was really exciting that I feel like I learned from that exercise was that election officials are already doing amazing work validating their processes. We didn't need to completely reinvent the wheel, though we came up with a new paradigm in our process for how to do election audits. And we recognize we want to focus on all kinds of election processes, not just post-election tabulation audits, but of everything. We learned that we pretty much are already in parity and on the same page with a lot of election officials. Their biggest concern isn't about whether or not it's important to do audits and test and quality controls. It's just how they can get the time and resources to be able to do that effectively. And I'm going to urge people, just like Michelle did, to please read our report, and I'll direct you specifically to page 11 if you want to learn more about that workshop, because I think just having the foundation of knowledge, the body of literature that we've already worked on with all of these great folks from across the country will help people very quickly be able to implement some test quality controls and audits and fit them into their schedules as busy election officials in a way they might not have thought they could.
Thanks, Danny. Just listening to you, I am reminded of that energy and that excitement that we had when we started to see that synergy of people sort of recognizing the value of this and recognizing that they were doing this already. Mike, I'm going to go to you next. We ended that first workshop by discussing, as Danny mentioned, some of the gaps that exist in the current election audit landscape, and what's preventing all states from adopting and implementing robust pre- and post-election audit procedures. So can you share some of those challenges that surfaced during that workshop?
Yes, absolutely. So when we were going into the workshop, at first we were trying to build this giant systems map with the circles and the arrows and how does what's limiting processes and what's enabling processes. And in the end, this part of the workshop just took place as a large conversation amongst all the participants. So, the walls were covered with giant sticky notes and this little stickers and votes and markers, but we all just kind of sat back down and just had a large group conversation. We said, okay, this all looks great. We're here in support of audits. We have a lot of great ideas about this. What are some real world hurdles that might keep us from getting from point A to B? So the group built some consensus around this. And the top potential barriers were people, policies, technology, space, time, and communication. And yes, I was reading those directly from my notes. I want to make sure I got that right. So first I will say, when we're talking about people as barriers, we're not talking about people who are against audits. We're talking about what are those real barriers that we experience in our office as current and former election officials. Where are we going to get the staffing to conduct these sorts of audits? How are we going to work with legislatures to make sure that they understand our voting systems? We want our audits to be transparent. We want public participation. How do we get observers to understand these really complex processes that we're reviewing during our audits? So some of the other things, some of the other barriers, hindrances, technology. We want to have this as a, not to overgeneralize, but a national conversation. We're all using different technology in different states, even within the same state. Some of us are using ballot on demand printers. Some of us are pre-printing ballots. There's just a lot of differences in how we would conduct audits. Some other very practical limitations. Where are we going to get the space to conduct these audits? Some of us are already looking at how do we expand our warehouses simply to store equipment? Where are we going to conduct these audits? I'm sure everyone on the call who's an election official can appreciate, where are we going to find the time to do these? Our schedules are already pretty busy. I joke that the election season is like, how do you squeeze 800 hours into 500 office hours? So where are we going to find time to also do audits on top of this? So as election officials, our goal is really feasibility in this whole project, right? So if elections are decentralized and conducted locally and so different from state to state, and we value that our elections are local, how do we overcome these hurdles, and how do we make sense in a this kind of national context where on this call we could have officials from across the country and this makes sense to everybody? And I think that's kind of the answer to that, I think, kind of segues into the second section, which is, even though we have all these differences, we can probably build some consensus around the principles and standards around audits. And so that's really the shift that we started to take going into the second workshop.
Thanks, Mike. And I'm so excited that we're going to come back to those principles and standards, because they really did play a critical role. So as you might guess, we were so excited about the outcome of this first workshop, we decided to do another one and invite a different group of election officials, election professionals to join us. We held that second audit workshop in March of this year, and it was really designed to expand and build upon the findings from the first workshop. Michelle, you led a session that aimed to sort of iterate on that process map that you described earlier and build consensus around the process areas where we might perform audits, tests, or quality control checks. Can you share a little more about those activities and what we learned from that session?
Yes. So as Jennifer mentioned, we invited different people to the second workshop, which we thought was really important, because while we had a broad variety of people participate in the first workshop, we wanted to be sure that we hadn't led them in a particular direction. So we invited new people to make sure that what we found out in the first workshop was kind of universal among election officials. So we started with the second group. And we went back to the same election map. This time we didn't use butcher paper. We had some pre-printed posters with each of those categories that I mentioned before, and then each of the tasks underneath those major categories. And then we had also pre-marked where the first group of participants had identified the audits, tests, and quality control measures, and where they fit best within those categories of election processes. So that we had little circles, red, green, and yellow, that had A, T, or QC within them. So then we had our second group of participants, and we handed out some more markers, some more stickers, some more Post-it notes, and all of that, because that's how you run a workshop. And we invited them to add to the existing posters and find out whether or not we were still missing any of the processes, or whether certain things that the first group had identified as more quality control was really more auditing, or vice versa. So that we had a lot of fun with that, and the groups we had the posters kind of split up around the room, and everyone kind of took their time to first orient themselves with what we were talking about, and then try to figure out how to add to the discussion. From all of that, we concluded that there were really 5 areas that were ripe for more discussion about audits, in addition to the post-election tabulation audits that we're more familiar with. So we talked about voter registration list maintenance, ballot proofing, ballot management, and by that I mean the reconciliation and ballot counting that everyone should be doing as a best practice. Also, mail ballot verification, whether you use signatures or some other method to validate the ballots that are coming back to the election office. And then a really broad area of security. We talked about cybersecurity, physical security, and all of that that comes under that umbrella that election offices should be doing, and figured out that that's another area that should maybe be audited.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I think, again, it was really exciting to just see that consensus happening. There's always this apprehension, like, are we all looking at this the same way? Are we so siloed that we've sort of come to one method of thinking? And so it was neat to just sort of see, again, the second group zero in on those 5 areas. And so, Danny, I'd love to turn to you for just a minute and have you share some of the ways we approach designing an audit for each of those 5 process areas that Michelle outlined.
Sure. Thanks, Jen. So I'm going to say it again. This was maybe my favorite part of the second workshop that we conducted, which is why I'm going to chat about this a little bit. But it was really interesting when we sort of got into the designing an audit portion of our work. I think for those of us on this panel, we sort of knew from the beginning that we were going down 2 parallel tracks for these 2 parts of our report, that we wanted to create one report that suggests a paradigm for how we're going to think about elections. And within that paradigm, make sure that we're auditing all of our election processes, not just doing post-election tabulation audits. But I also think we already sort of knew we were going to go down a second track as well, which was going to be, let's get input from real election officials, people with boots on the ground, on what these audits are going to look like, to make sure that they're going to be feasible and practical and provide value to election officials, that they're going to be worth doing. So we talked a lot about the different ways we could sort of extract that information from our participants in a way that would allow them to be creative and feel engaged. And where we landed was on creating a designing an audit workbook. So TAG just made this small workbook. It was a few pages, but it asked our participants to answer some pretty deep questions about these 5 different audit topics. So we broke folks into groups by subject. So we had some folks working on ballot proofing audits, other on a list maintenance audit, others on a security audit, et cetera. And we made sure even within those groups that we had a pretty diverse set of individuals. So folks from different size jurisdictions, some folks who are state or local administrators, different amount of years of experience and different topic experience. And we didn't always put them in the group that we thought they would have the most knowledge about, because we really wanted folks to open their minds and be creative. Through the workbook, some of the detailed questions we asked were, what information or artifacts are going to be needed to perform this audit? What actual resources would you need in your office? What would be a good sample size for this audit, which is a question we're still grappling with for a lot of our work. What kinds of evidence or report would your audit generate? Because something that's really key to the way that we're thinking about audits is not just making sure election officials know that they're doing a good job, but also having some way to demonstrate to the public that this work is being done accurately, fairly, and correctly. So that was sort of a really fantastic opportunity. And we learned a lot, I think, in that process. One thing that sort of came out of the audit design workshop for me was first that folks already have really great ideas. Again, we don't have to reinvent the wheels. A lot of the folks who participated were not just sort of abstractly generating processes. They were talking about what they already do in their offices and just thinking, how can we put these things together in a system rather than doing them disparately? Another really just fantastic observation from that workshop was it was so cool to see election administrators in the front seat, because I know from my personal experience, for a lot of election officials, when we are conducting audits, the rules come from state legislatures, and the folks on the state legislature might not have the same level of knowledge or experience in administering an election that election officials do. So it's going to look different when election officials write the rules. So yeah, I think those were the really great parts of the experience. At the end of that sort of designing an audit process, one like sort of final great part was that we posted highlights on the board from those workbooks. So we sort of tried our best to distill those processes into like high level activities, high level processes you would do to audit. And participants sort of walked around the room and looked at all of those different audits of ballot proofing, et cetera. And they noticed that there's actually a lot that they shared in common, not just in how they were conducted, but like sort of what was important as an end goal for those audits. And I think that started to guide us down the path of thinking about the kinds of principles and standards that need to be included for these nationwide sort of audits that are going to look different as applied in states and localities.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks for guiding us back to those principles. We're going to talk a little bit more. Before we do, I want to just do a quick round with all three of you. One thing that was interesting to me is part of that workbook, we asked our participants to think about how they might communicate that audit to voters and other stakeholders. There were a couple of kind of high level things that came out of that discussion. Would any of you like to share some of what we learned when we started to think about how best to communicate audits, or the results of the audit, I should say?
I will, I'll jump back in real quick. This is an observation I know that we have all made and discussed before, but something that was really cool to me is from more than one participant, sort of completely independently, we heard this same idea, which is maybe it would be great to have more than one audit report that we generate for different kinds of audits. And what the participants meant by that was that maybe we need to have one audit report that's sort of long and completely comprehensive, that is meant to be used by election officials, legislatures, administrators, folks who are going to sort of continue to craft and hone and perfect our audit processes. And then maybe we need to think about having a more plain language, like clear, shorter summary report that is for public consumption, just to make sure that for folks in the public who are really invested, who want to know how these processes work, but who do not have the luxury or the benefit of being election officials themselves, of being able to dedicate, their full-time job to learning about this stuff. We wanted to make sure that we have a report that's digestible and accessible to them as well. So I thought that was just a really great concept, and the fact that it was iterative and more than one person brought it up tells me that there's, if not consensus, at least a desire within the elections community to think about what resources do we need and what resources do we need to give the public to conduct these things ethically.
That's awesome. Thanks, Danny. Mike or Michelle, is there anything either of you would like to add there?
Yeah, I just was actually thinking about one of our struggle points when we were at the workshop and actually trying to work through the workbooks. Some of us were having difficulty thinking about audit processes versus the processes that were being audited. And so what I mean to say there is, like with ballot proofing, you're going to have to check the sources of all of the material of, where the candidates came from and the ballot measures and all that stuff. But an audit isn't really doing that again, because that's just more proofing. So the audit itself would be maybe checking that the procedures were complete and that they were followed and that there was a checklist that everybody checked off and signed off on. And so I think that goes into the communication as well. So we're not just saying that these independent auditors, whoever they're going to be, are going to come behind us as election officials and make sure we did our jobs right by redoing the jobs. They're more going to check the processes themselves, and then maybe for different types of elections, check a sample of the items being audited and go back to the sources. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that very well, but that's one of the things where we were really struggling with creating the audits themselves. Maybe Mike can help.
Go ahead, Mike. Anything you want to add there?
Well, actually, I was just going to plus one to what Danny was saying, plus one to Michelle too, but plus one to, to what Danny was saying about election officials. Just our desire to make sure that the public, to be transparent and to make sure that the public really does understand audits, so that this idea that, we do hear from academics as well, who may have just an incredible breadth of knowledge in what needs to go statistically into the audits that we do. And so we do maybe need to build a report that will make sense to them and be meaningful for them. But it's also incredibly important for us to make sure that just the general public, and it was just really refreshing. You knew that was going to come out, but it was nice to see, to just be sitting amongst other election officials and see that, absolutely their heads and their hearts were in that space of, how do we communicate this to all of our audiences?
Yeah, that's great. And I guess I'll just add, we get asked all the time, what's the first thing we can do if we want to start thinking about ways to enhance the accuracy and the way we validate our elections. And we always say, make sure you have standard written standard operating procedures, as Michelle sort of alluded to, right? That's sort of the foundation. Okay, Mike, you're going to kind of bring us home here before we go to Q&A. The concepts for principles and standards are interwoven throughout all of the reports we published so far. It was a subject I know we wrestled with as a team, as well as something that we put in front of the election officials at our second audit workshop. Can you share just some of the examples we looked at, as well as some of the principles that we all finally agreed on?
Yeah, sure. So first, just this idea of principles and standards, right? Like when we talk about principles, we sort of intuitively know what that means until someone asks us for a definition of a principle, then it becomes a little challenging. So as a group of election professionals, in a very practical sense, what we meant by principles were, how do we develop consensus around our values, and how do we then articulate them so we can all kind of be talking about the same thing? And if we could build consensus around principles for audits, we could really be striving for the same goals, going back to that earlier concept, despite the fact that we're using different technologies, we're coming from very different jurisdictions throughout the nation. There's an opportunity to agree on our principles and our values and to articulate them and to build election audits around that. So that's kind of how these principles are how we're able to stay, to stay local and unique, but still have some universal approach to audits. So now the principles that we built consensus around, similar to the first workshop, this happened more through just a large group, facilitating a large group conversation. So we had a pretty deep conversation, I felt, about principles and what are the principles that we need to bring to audits. And ultimately, we landed on several. First, audits must be conducted ethically, right? There has to be some expectations for professional behavior and for what's going to be done during audits. There also has to be independence between the auditor and the subject. We really shouldn't be auditing our own work, and that also creates a challenge because who's going to understand our work in order to be able to audit it? But having independence was very important to us. We also need to establish reasonable timeframes for conducting audits. Are these going to happen immediately, before certification or after certification of the results? There needs to be standards for how we manage evidence. For example, if there's a discrepancy found in the evidence, what does that mean to us? Does that trigger a legal action, or is that simply reported on our audit report? We have to have the objectives of the audit need to be incredibly clear. An audit is not just a giant discovery of everything under the sun related to an election. It's a specific event where we're looking at a specific topic. So that was an important principle for the group. As alluded to earlier, transparency has to be is a very important principle to us. I think we've all had those. I hope we've all had those very easy elections. None of them are actually easy, but those elections where election night comes and goes, there's really no close races, public interest sort of wanes, and we go through all of our post-election processes and all of our audits, and it just goes very quietly. I think that expectation has there's now just this expectation that our audits need to be incredibly transparent. There's going to be an incredible amount of interest in all the processes pre and post election. So we really need to make sure that transparency is an important principle for us. And also something very practical, we need to preserve voter privacy. That's another very important principle during our audits, whether we're auditing voter registration, auditing ballot tabulation, voter privacy is paramount. So in tandem with principles, we also had a discussion of standards. And part of that discussion was taking a look at some existing standards that are already out there within the public sector. For example, we have NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. They build standards around all sorts of industries, everything from nanotechnology to medicine, cybersecurity. Something that we're all very familiar with, we looked at VVSGs, the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines. What are the standards for testing voting equipment to make sure that the equipment is accessible, to make sure it's functional, to make sure it's secure? So we took a look at some existing standards to try to build off those. And finally, we took a look at the Government Accountability Office, what they have, the GAGAS, if I'm pronouncing that acronym correct. It's a GAGAS. They are the generally acceptable government accounting standards. These are the standards that are presented for conducting audits throughout government. And we found those particularly helpful, and I think you'll see them cited throughout our guide. We were able to glean a great deal from them. So back to our workshops, our participants did flag several opportunities to create standards for audits, and we were able to build some consensus. And just some of those, we were able to define. We need to have standards around how we define the scope of an audit, how do we handle discrepancies. We need standards around how we collect and secure and review evidence. And something where we probably could use some help from academia, and a lot of that has occurred already. Hey, how do we build standards around collecting sample sizes? What's an appropriate sample size? We can use some assistance and standards on those. So I think that wraps up my response. I'm happy to hand it back.
Thanks, Mike, so much. That was such a great overview of how we thought about principles and standards. I think it's also, just listening to you, a reminder to me of how comprehensive and a little bit challenging, actually, this is to sort of think about. I would encourage anybody listening. I know the report is long, part 1. We did pare it down quite a bit. But if you don't feel like reading all of it right now, I really would encourage you to go to that principles section. It's one of the areas I get most excited about, because I think it's something that the time is ripe, that we find a robust set of principles that we can get behind. Danny, Michelle, is there anything that is top of mind for you when we think about principles? Anything you'd like to add to what Mike said, or that you were reflecting on that came out of the workshop?
I think for me, one of the most exciting part about starting to craft these principles was, like, I really think it is sort of the glue that brings this like new paradigm we're suggesting for audits together. So what I mean by that is, we have this tension that we recognize and appreciate that Mike mentioned earlier, which is that states, and especially localities within states, do everything differently, right? Like, we're all sort of aiming for the same goal. We're trying to end up conducting elections that are fair and where everyone who should be voting gets to vote. Like that's the goal. It's like qualified voters get to vote and participate in the process. But our laws and our procedures in states are so different. Like, how do we sort of find this nexus where we can create a national dialogue, where we can start to find areas of consensus? And I think the principles that we came up with sort of led us down that path. I mean, even like the idea of independence, which is one of like the most important principles, not just for auditing, at least for audits in general, having a different body conduct the audit than the body that actually conducted the process. I think just by engaging with that idea of independence, it became really clear to us quickly that there was going to be a way to start to apply these like bigger audit ideas, like a ballot proofing audit, to find a way to tailor it to the way that everyone is sort of conducting their processes within their jurisdictions.
Thanks, Danny. And I'm so glad that you mentioned independence. we're actually, Michelle, I promise I'll get to, we're going to transition to audience Q&A. And before we do that, in addition to the reports that are published on our website, we plan to add some additional reports in that part 2 section, especially around security audits and potentially one on district precinct assignment audits. Our plan is to continue to engage with election professionals along with other experts to just keep developing the part 2 guides. We're all about iteration, and we'd like to continue to hone those, do some pilot projects with those, and improve on what we have. We also plan to hold future webinars on specific topics, some of which you heard a little bit about here, related to election audits, such as determining an appropriate sample size and who conducts the audits. But we do have a question in the chat that I'm really excited somebody brought up. It's an excellent question. Danny mentioned it. I'm going to pick on Michelle in a minute. The question is, you mentioned that one of the principles was independence. What suggestions do you have to achieve this? And I'll tell you, we thought a lot about this, and this is one of the areas where we certainly heard from election administrators, hey, this could be challenging. We looked at models, and Michelle, I'd love for you to share some of those that we looked at where other states are using citizen audit boards or thinking about how to better use our Canvas boards. We even thought recently about how could an election office or check or audit another election office if there was sensitive data or data that we wanted to be really careful in maintaining privacy. But Michelle, I'd love to turn to you and just get your reflection, since I know you spent a lot of time on that section of the report, which I believe we titled, Who Conducts an Audit?
That is true. And I think it's an interesting area. And I don't think with the audits that we proposed, I don't think there's a one size fits all. So, the people that might audit your security are probably not going to be the same people that are going to audit your ballot proofing procedures. I mean, those are just apples and oranges. There is a lot of difference. We all know that there's the people that actually conduct the canvass, whether it's a county commissioner, county board, or there's the state panel. I mean, from my experience in Arizona, that was the Secretary of State, the governor, the Supreme Court justice. I mean, they're not actually going to have the time or will probably to do the nitty-gritty of the audits that we're kind of talking about here. So I think that there's a bigger discussion to be had, and maybe that's going to be one of the topics of our webinars going forward. New Mexico has a really interesting way of doing audits where they actually have an auditor that is appointed by the Secretary of State, and then they develop the sample size and all of that. I think that one of the things that we talked about in both of our workshops was the struggle between having a fully independent group of people that does the audits with people that have absolutely no understanding of how elections are running. So we need to have some balance on that continuum somewhere where we have people that understand election processes and procedures, but aren't the ones actually doing the work, because we also want to have the independence there. So I do think that idea that Jen, you mentioned at the end about having different counties audit each other, I think that's really interesting. But then that goes back to the time and the feasibility question. So I think that all of these questions are kind of complicated, and it's part of this larger discussion that we hope to keep having. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's great, Michelle. What that makes me reflect on is, again, coming back to this sort of idea, this framework that we've laid out of principles and standards. I think as we look and discuss these different types, at least these 5 different types of audits that we've put forward in this first set of part 2 reports, it was clear in our conversations during our workshops and as a team that each of these audits might actually require different type of auditor. And so we hope that at least initially some of those principles help address that, or give some ideas in the report, in that who conducts an audit section of the report, of who might be an independent body or independent group of individuals who could help with that. For example, security audits, super sensitive information that we're thinking about when we think about cybersecurity protocols, somebody evaluating how those are working, same for our physical security protocols. That might be an audit that is best placed in the lap of the Secretary of State or a state auditor. Certainly some of those like ballot proofing may not make sense to have such a formal process. I think with tabulation audits, there's so much public scrutiny. We definitely want to look for ways to have public involvement there, whether it's a citizen audit board or sort of reimagining how we use our Canvas boards. So I agree, more to think about there. Certainly, I think we've planted a great seed. I think we have time for one more question, and I think this will be kind of a round robin question. The question is, was there anything that surprised you through your research? Kind of a tough one, but Danny, can I pick on you first?
Sure. I think the first thing that came to mind for me was a pleasant surprise, which was that as we engaged with all of our participants at workshops, we knew we were introducing a pretty ambitious idea, which is we think there's value in performing audits across the entire election process. We think there's value in being able to demonstrate that we're doing our processes correctly and also giving the public confidence that we're doing our processes correctly. But we also realize that tension that Mike and Michelle have both brought up, which is that election officials are already so overworked and often on top of being overworked in a lot of jurisdictions, understaffed and under-resourced. So how do we get folks on board with the idea that there is value to performing more audits and audits of different systems and creating new audits? And I guess the surprise, the pleasant one for me was that it wasn't a hard pitch, that a lot of the folks we brought into this room, again, people from different political parties, from different sized jurisdictions, people with more or less staff, all sort of were able to quickly buy into the idea that, like, yes, even though we already have a ton of work to do, it's just so critical that we take this extra step of being able to demonstrate to the public that we're doing things correctly and they should be confident in this essential part of our democracy. And for me, that was just like, one, like filled my heart with joy, but two, I think like from a emotional endurance place, like really propelled me through us putting the hard work into preparing these two reports, was just knowing that once people click on that link and read the reports and start to engage with the material, they quickly start to see like, yeah, I can do this. There are feasible ways to work this into my process. And it is absolutely worth thinking about audits differently and thinking about audits of the whole election process.
Thanks, Danny. Michelle, any surprises?
I've actually been sitting here trying to think about it the whole time, and it's not like we knew everything going into this, but the only thing that popped into my head right now was in the report, we talked about this bipartisan bill that was introduced something like 20 years ago. I don't remember the exact date. And it was in Congress, a bipartisan bill to have better audits. And to think about a bipartisan bill at all right now is really surprising to me, without getting too far into politics. But that this isn't new. This is something that has been out there for 20 plus years, and we're just trying to put a better framework on it.
That's fantastic. Mike, any surprises for you?
Yeah, sure. For me, one of the surprises was just the way that the guides took shape. So I think at first going into this, I was thinking in my head that, okay, if we're going to actually be designing an audit, step by step, here's the first thing that you're going to do in the audit, here's the second thing that you're going to do, here's the kind of report you're going to run, here's what the chart needs to look like. And really, it was much more general and open. And I think that made those guides a lot more accessible for me. So rather than saying, for example, who should observe this audit? We didn't come up with a list of titles. These are the people who can observe. These are the people who can. It was more just, what are the general considerations for who can observe an audit, and how can we do that effectively? So I just found that was kind of surprising, because I think I was expecting at the front end to produce something much more stringent and technical. And I think what came out of this was something a little more open.
That's great. Certainly lots of wise words of wisdom from all three of you. I get to speak to election officials all the time about audits and other things. It has just been a pleasure, and it's just like warmed my heart to be able to have this conversation with three amazing members of my team. Really, really glad to have you all here. We're going to do a lightning round. You all get a minute each. Just sort of final thoughts from each of you on what do you want to see or hope to see as a result of this project. Michelle.
Oh, the pressure. I want to see feedback. I want people to engage with our reports and come back to us. And whether that's, I don't know, something like you've missed this whole topic and we need to do an audit on this area, or what are you thinking? We can't do an audit like this, or if it's just like, help us develop something for our jurisdiction and with our specific needs and resources. I think that's what I'm looking for.
Fantastic. Danny?
So I'll plus one what Michelle said. The thing I am absolutely most excited about is just receiving all of the feedback from anyone in the field who has worked in elections, because so far, everyone I've spoken to who has worked in an elections office has had something valuable to contribute to this project. And then maybe to be specific and put a little bit of a finer point on it, something I hope to see is that election administrators, and I'm not sure the exact mechanism yet, but I'd love to see them be in more of a leadership, more driving the ship on how we conduct our audits. Because like I said earlier, so often, especially in like the realm of post-election tabulation audits, a lot of us are handed rules by our state legislatures or by our state bodies and told to administer them. And I just would love to see more of what election officials come up with when they're given an opportunity to say, here's how we should validate our own processes.
Fantastic. Mike?
Yeah, sure. So the two things that I would like to see, one is I would love to get some feedback on just, is this a reasonable approach? Just that direct question is, are we heading in the right direction? Are these guides that are feasible, are usable? The other thing that I would like to see is, I hope that we can get a lot of feedback on and to kind of help continue to nudge us to look at audits in all across the spectrum of elections. I think even today, even just all the examples that come to my head are all tabulation audits. And I think that's great and that's incredibly important. But I hope that we continue to, I hope that some of the other areas like list maintenance perhaps start to become part of the conversation just as intuitively and automatically as tabulation.
Thanks, Mike. +1 to all three of you. I certainly have some of the same hopes and desires. I hope this project leads to more research. I want to see more resources to help election officials develop robust systems for system testing and quality control checks, along with the pre and post election audits that we talked about. Ultimately, I hope that audits can play a role in building trustworthy elections. I think that's been the goal for all of us all along. I want to thank everyone who tuned in today. Thank you for those of you, whether you're listening or not, that contributed to this report, that took part in our workshop. We couldn't have done this without you. We're certainly looking forward to engaging with you again in the future. If you do want to give feedback on our Part 2 guides, please send that to support@electionsgroup.com. Please be patient. If our response is slow, we are still fully engaged in providing support and training for summer election conferences, but we promise to get back to anybody that is willing to take the time to give us some feedback on those reports. All of the resources mentioned have been placed in the chat. Additional information as well as direct support from us can be found at www.electionsgroup.com. If you haven't signed up for our newsletter, which is really just a way to ensure that you're getting notifications when we do cool webinars like this, or we put out a new product or new resource, please go to our website and sign up. We'd love to get you on our list. And thank you all so much. We'll see you next time.